Long Voyage Back, page 5. Her 3 white hulls slicing quietly through the water, her giant Genoa bellying out to starboard, vagabonds sailed into the bay. Neil Loken sat in the port cockpit of the large trimaran, watching the causeway of Cheapskate Bay Bridge Tunnel, through which they had just passed, recede behind them. At the wheel, Jim Storr was peering ahead and shifting his weight excitedly from one foot to the other. Although his father owned Vagabond, this was the first time Jim had made landfall after a long ocean passage, and his boyish face, haloed by the rays of the early morning sun, showed it. He looked to Neil at that moment, his slender, broad-shouldered body bronzed by their 5 days at sea, like a sea-going pan. But Neil didn't share Jim's excitement and joy. Sailing up into the wide mouth and throat of the bay depressed him. He was an ocean sailor, and he rarely enjoyed leaving the clear, deep waters of the open sea for the mud and shallows of inshore bays and inlets. And it didn't help that Cheapskate was a sort of home. He'd attended the US Naval Academy at Annapolis for 4 years, and after serving in Vietnam for 3, captained a 40-foot sloop based in Norfolk for several summers. Sailing down the bay out to sea often meant adventure, freedom and escape. Sailing it into meant land, civilization, the complications of returning home. As he looked forward to examine the set of the mainsail in Genoa and to check Jim's course towards the next buoy, he was also troubled by the quite mundane fact that Vagabond's propeller shaft had been struck and bent by a submerged log off Cape Hatteras, which had left the big trimaran with no auxiliary power. How long it would take to sail her up the next 75 miles to Point Lookout to pick up Frank Storr and his guests would depend on the wind, a notoriously unreliable friend, especially in the Cheapskate. "Hey, look," Jim said suddenly, pointing past Neil towards Norfolk. "Warships, 3 of them." Turning, Neil sighted along the horizon and saw 3 long grey vessels moving out of Hampton Roads, heading out of the southern channel towards the bridge in the ocean. 2 were destroyers, the 3rd a ship the Navy must have designed since he'd resigned his commission. A supply ship, maybe? But since when was a supply ship accompanied by 2 destroyers? "I wonder where they're going," Jim went on, looking past Neil now through binoculars, holding the large stainless steel wheel in place by the pressure of his bare chest. Like Neil, he was wearing only a pair of blue jean cutoffs. "There are always a few ships from Norfolk Naval Base either coming or going," Neil said quietly. But even as he said this, he recognized still another reason he was depressed: the slow, awkward, terrifying way the US and Russia seemed to be trying to frighten each other into war. For the last 3 days, the radio news reports had been increasingly disturbing. Wednesday, an American reconnaissance plane was downed by an Iraqi missile, probably fired from a launcher manned by Russians. Yesterday, the US had rejected the Soviets' bilateral troop withdrawal proposal, denouncing it as extortionate. Today, the US government had reinforced its marine units in Saudi Arabia. Neil had listened to these radio reports alone. "You ever serve in ships like those?" Jim asked, lowering his binoculars and smiling, still excited about the recent landfall. "No, I was lucky," Neil replied, turning back to Jim. "They put me in the smallest combat vessels the Navy had, coastal patrol boats." "You ever get sunk?" Jim asked next. Neil smiled, his stern face suddenly lit up, his blue eyes crinkling. Jim's boyish curiosity about things compensated for some otherwise annoying habits. His perchance for listening to loud rock music at every opportunity, and for leaving food, towels, dishes and clothing strewn around the boat as if they were precious jewels he had magnanimously bestowing upon the poverty-ridden ship. But Jim's enthusiasm redeemed him in Neil's eyes. That, and the important fact that he turned out to be an excellent sailor. "No, I can't say I did," Neil replied, standing up watching the distant warships. "In fact, most of the war, I and some of my men were thoroughly depressed that no one ever fired at us." "But Dad said you were wounded," Jim said. "Oh yeah," Neil agreed. "Occasionally we got lucky." "And you sunk a lot of ships?" "So they say," said Neil, feeling himself getting tense about the direction the conversation was taking. He walked towards Jim and began doing chin-ups from the edge of the wheelhouse roof, He had a muscular gymnast's body, browned by the sun like Jim's, but thicker, more mature, that of a well-conditioned athlete in his 30s. Like Jim, he held his 6-foot frame with military erectness, but his face, unlike Jim's, was weathered and lined, a light scar running into his hairline at the right temple. His blue eyes often pinned people with distracting coldness, and could suddenly light up and crinkle with the warmth of his smile. His shock of thick brown hair was uncombed and stiffly awry from the salt water and wind. "Well?" insisted Jim. Neil lowered himself from the last chin-up and moved into the wheelhouse and stood beside the 18-year-old. 2 empty glasses sat on the wheelhouse shelf, reminders of the whiskey they'd drank at dawn when they'd sighted land for the first time since northern Florida. Neil picked up one and drained it. "It was a push-button war, even for the smallest ships," he said slowly. "We killed at long range. If we ever happened to see what havoc we had wrought, it was always a little disconcerting to find that the enemy gunboat, or Kong supply ship, looked suspiciously like a fishing boat, and the dead and dying like bony fishermen." Neil paused, staring through the windows of the wheelhouse, forward past Vagabond's wide white deck and mainmast to the grey waves stretching out ahead. "Some of them must have been Kong?" said Jim. "Oh, sure," said Neil. "Is that why you resigned your commission?" "That and a dozen other reasons." He didn't go on. He walked back out of the wheelhouse to end the conversation. He knew he'd been the wrong man for the job. When he graduated from Annapolis, he'd been fully prepared to stand on the quarterdeck and fight to the last man. But he wasn't prepared to stand and blast away, not knowing whether he was killing good guys or bad guys, rarely being fired at in return, and forbidden by standing orders to pick up the wounded survivors. Resigning his commission had both been a protest against a specific war and an acknowledgement that for him, even if the war could be justified, the technological and impersonal means of fighting it could not. For years after resigning, he'd been a loner, unsuited to either the unregimented chaos of civilian life or the companionship of his old Navy friends. A woman had brought him back to life, but after a year and a half, with abrupt arbitrariness of battle, she'd been killed in an auto accident. Since then he'd found a healthier solitude as a professional captain of wealthy men's yachts, re-establishing some of the order that he'd liked in military life and finding a closeness with the sea and sky that seemed to heal. Staring up at the set of the mainsail, he noticed 2 trails of jet vapour inching across the sky, the thin cotton lines tinged with pink and seeming to emerge from nowhere in the west and to be disappearing into nowhere in the east. The planes themselves were invisible. When a loud sonic boom broke the stillness of the early morning, Jim turned quickly towards Neil. "What was that?" he exclaimed. Neil pointed to the vapour trails in the sky. Jim seemed momentarily frightened, but then grinned. "I thought the destroyers had opened fire on us," he said. Neil watched the cotton trails disappear into the brightness of the east. "Welcome back to civilization."